Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Bryce, and we're doing a pair of episodes talking about high and low mage count settings. With me today is my guest, Terry. Terry, say hello.
Hi. It was just
Thank
weird
you.
hearing you say it because there was this thing where it's like, that's not how dad does it. That's not how mom makes my ham sandwich. She cuts it diagonally, not lengthwise. I didn't realize that you cut sandwiches diagonally because it ensures that they're half and half. I've been trying to do that with other foods. Like, I wish there were a way to do that with a slice of pizza, because if there's anything I've learned, it's there is no measurement tool more precise than a child that feels that they have been shortchanged.
The trick is to have one child pick where to slice, and the other child pick who gets which slice.
So it's always better to be the second guy in that one. That's the problem
Yeah, I
I
know.
have with it. That's why you bring scales to a children's birthday party at the local roller rink. And that's the solution I've come up with.
Chef scales, kitchen scales, yeah.
In other news, I haven't been invited back to Rollerama.
All right, so let's go ahead and jump right into this topic. Terry, how many mages are there?
This is one of the most frustratingly complicated questions that can be asked. Thus, I have created a Storyteller Vault supplement that tries to address it. But yeah,
Find a link in our show notes.
Yeah, for more information, see Ascension's Landscape, which is at 495 sales. I am 5 sales away from my weird little GM booklet turning into a gold seller, and that pleases me to no end. So it is hard to know within the canon of the game how many mages there are, but to me there's kind of 3 different data sources. Sometimes you just get a head count, where, for instance, you read Dragon of the East and they're like, this is how many Wu Kang and Wu Long mages you are. And they're like, that's good to know. Or the fact that there are 6 Solificati around the time of Revised. Book of Crafts, Testament of the First Cabal, Fallen Tower Las Vegas, and the Order of Hermes Tradition book all provide a number for some sect or group. My favorite are the ones that don't match each other, where they're like, there's this many mages. Another one's like, no, there's precisely this many mages. Hidden Lore puts the count between 2,000 and 10,000. So late 90s, 5.8 billion people leads to a ratio of awakened to sleepers of like 1 per 580,000 to 1 per 3 million. If one takes that number from Hidden Lore and adjusts it down for like the Second Inquisition and the effects of the Avatar Storm, the lower bound could be maybe 1,000 mages. But then we have Fallen Tower Las Vegas, which is like, Vegas has a lot of mages. There's 25 out of 1.4 million people, which comes to 1 every like 50,000 or something. The second source is if you were to like combine references and biographies received in all the books and all the chantries and cabals that are mentioned and being in all quarters of the world. And sometimes there are several in the city where they're like, this block's controlled by this chantry. This block's controlled by this chantry. I'm like, 2 chantries? Interesting. If one assumes all these references are true at the same time, there are a lot of mages, a lot more mages, especially in the US, especially towards the coasts. If one assumes that the US isn't quite a hotbed of awakening, kind of based on these estimates, we get there to be about 50,000 mages on the face of the planet. The final source is the implication that mages are not known by a lot of people. So there are a few sleeper allies, but part of this whole secret society thing is that like intelligence agencies haven't really caught on to it. So people may have seen magic and just dismissed it or stayed tight-lipped about it at some point. And this suggests kind of a lower mage count world unless you include paranoia and skepticism as a thing. So it's hard to figure out, but those numbers, that 2,000 to 10,000, that feels low compared to what the setting implies. Do you have any like feel for it?
Personally, I prefer a higher count than 25 per 1.5 million. But that's just me. It's real hard to do faction versus faction and assume that there's more than if there's 2 dream speakers in the world. How is that tradition continuing?
How do?
Yeah, and how are they a threat to the consensus if there's 17 active mages in the world?
Well, I have some guidelines on how to calibrate that. Would you like to hear them?
I would love to hear how you calibrate.
So we're going to do this a la the IBM video, who was directed by Ray and Charles Ames. Most reductive case, I guess the most reductive case is there are 0 mages, in which case we are no longer playing Mage the Ascension. But the next closest would be there's 1 mage, there's a mage pope or something. Every mage in creation could fit in an airplane bathroom. Going up a power of 10, there's 10 mages. That makes them roughly 1 in a billion. They're about as common as a leader of a G8 nation. They're like the Illuminati or the Cabal and Marvel, very small, very powerful group. Now all of our mages can fit in a large closet. What if there's 100 mages? They're now 1 in 100 million. There's only 100 active astronauts in the world. So mages are as rare as astronauts. They represent the absolute best of humanity. There's low demand for them. You could fit them all in one reasonably large fast food restaurant. They wouldn't be all able to sit down, but you could fit them in there. The important part to me about there being 100 is you could know them all. Like, you could just know all their names.
Sure.
Yeah.
I know 100 people.
Yeah. I know 100 people. Power 10 above that, 1,000. They're now 1 in roughly 10 million. This is me taking the 8 billion people that currently exist and just rounding it up to 10 billion for the sake of convenience. So there's 1,000 mages. That's 1 in 10 million. They're rare as professional sports umpires or the sums of all heads of state plus heads of Fortune 500 companies. About as rare as chess grandmasters. You could fit them all in a big movie theater or an auditorium. You know a lot of them by name or reputation, but not all of them. And it's kind of weird because, like, as I was doing this, I'm like, what is there 1,000 of? And, like, sports umpires are much rarer than I thought they were, like professional sports umpires. And then I'm like, oh, yeah, all of the MLB has, like, 5.
I guess that makes sense. They don't really have more than, a game or 2 or maybe 3 in a day. So, yeah, that one guy can do enough. And then he travels with the team. That makes sense.
At the 10,000 mages level, or 1 in a million, they're about as rare as professional opera singers. They would all fit in a very large convention hall or a smaller stadium. At 100,000 mages, or 1 in 100,000, they're about as rare as neurosurgeons. There's, in the US at least, there's 1 neurosurgeon per 90,000 people. Which again, I don't really have a good intuition on how many neurosurgeons there should be. But I guess that's enough that there's not a lot of neurosurgeons going, oh, I wish I had neurosurgery to do. At this point,
you don't want neurosurgeons to be bored. That's nothing good comes of that.
Nor do you want to live in a world where there are 2 in demand.
Good point. Yeah.
So at this point, you know very few of the mage community. At 1 million mages, or 1 in 10,000, they're about as rare as astrophysicists, people who make a living professionally observing space, or professional athletes. Another one was, this is roughly as rare as Ivy League graduates. So I got to be the other type of actuary to try and figure out what the extinction rate, that's the formal term for it, is for someone who went to, like, Harvard. And these kind of help me do that math. So the 2 layers to it is, how many mages are there? And then how big are your factions and how spread out are they? So if you're like a quarter of mages are tradition mages, and you say there are 10,000 mages and they're 1 in a million, that immediately knocks it down to 2,500 mages. And the tricky part is, you've got 9 traditions, each of them with 4 or 5 sub-factions, and then you got a bunch of continents. So how comfortable are you just saying, there aren't any Hermetics in France, or something like that? Or like, there are no Spanish Etherites. And that is something I'm very comfortable saying. I think it creates a interesting local flavor. It's like saying that Genoa doesn't have enough top-end steakhouses. I'm fine with that. It has its own local thing. And that's just kind of the avenue I attack these things from.
So if you go that route, just for a game that has no Spanish Etherites, for instance, to use your example, is there a local variant or like a local craft that takes their place? Or is in Spain, the Verbena are just more powerful because there's no Etherites to counter them?
The Verbena are just more powerful.
Okay.
There are certain areas that have political blocks. The games I play are generally a little bit more wish-fulfilling, so mages are generally nicer. If a clear Etherite, if someone literally checked the Kitab al-Asir out of their local library, awoke and is like, oh man, get me some ether, and your local collection of like Bruja weather witches are like, this is a boy, he is not like us. They would kind of shuffle him off and either probably relocate him to France or figure out a weird way to combine the two. Part of it is the fact that I think when people talk about factions and groups in Mage, they tend to focus on like certain stereotypes that I find bothersome. I know I'm like, don't stereotype this fictional group that doesn't actually exist. I get the irony of saying that. But to me, a lot of the groups are bigger. So it in my games, it is easy to have that Etherite inflected Verbena that's doing really advanced molecular herbalism or something like that, or finds a way to kind of split the line between the two, because the Etherites are an interesting choice because like they're not a paradigm, they're a meta paradigm. They're like a way to generate other paradigms. The idea that all things are true, but not all things are real. And the goal of the mage is to kind of expand that as much as humanly possible. That's a paradigm that really plays well with others, which I appreciate, as opposed to something that might be more restrictive.
So, speaking of in your games, where do you usually peg the number of mages in your games?
I usually put them at between 1 in 500,000 or rarer. And I usually do this by working backwards from like a city population. So on the extreme end, I've had contemporary games with fewer than 100, meaning that the player group was a not insubstantial quantity of all mages in existence. Kind of like when you're playing Exalted and you're like, ah, yes, my sidereal circle, we are 5% of the 5-score fellowship. My most recent game had 1 mage per 1 or 2 million people. And I usually get to that by figuring out how many mages I want in a city, figuring out how many are in that city's metropolitan statistical area, and working backwards from that. So for instance, in my most recent game, it took place in Philly. There's 6.5 million people in that region. And I'm like, yeah, I want about 20 mages. So that's how I came up with a number working backwards from that.
That tracks. And of course, you'll have more mages in large metropolitan areas because that's where things are. And mages want to be where things are and things happen.
Yeah. Cities.
Unless of course you have, the stereotypical, I'm a dirty, rotten necromancer. Nobody wants to hang out with me, so I'm going to go live in this little abandoned town in the middle of the Nevada desert.
And to me, those are also fascinating games where you're the sole magic user in a vast rural expanse and maybe an entire mountain range is under your thumb, or an entire county or several counties in Wisconsin you're just kind of in charge of. And to me, that's where Mage becomes a horror setting again. Like, yeah, there's the urban horror thing of like, the Nefandi are holding town hall. But I'm like, oh, this mad hermetic is trying to recreate the city of Pymander in Minnesota. Good luck to that. And that gets real messy. But yeah, I go the same way. Either they tend to cluster up in cities or they're out in the boonies. One of the things that I thought was interesting about Hunter is for Hunter 5th, they did really give you an idea of how to run a suburban game. And I'm curious about what like the Mage suburban craft would be. Like what it would be like if like the PTA were a craft or something like that. And
I was thinking of the Homeowners Association, and that's a horror game right there.
That's a subsect of the Nefandi. Yeah, that's not even... Yeah. I would not allow players to play that.
What was the lowest Mage count game that you ran?
I kind of bring this up because it's an extremal thing and not everyone's going to do it. But I ran a game where there were 100 mages. Avatars were very strong, and these dynamic creatures, though, kept kind of playing out these fights from the past. Some of the mages in the settings theorized that each person was an archetype from the tarot. Avatar lineages were known. When a mage died, there was a concerted search to kind of find the next one, like trying to find the next Passion Lama or Dalai Lama or something like that. Also, that kind of recycling made it so murder was less likely because you're like, well, this is just going to push this off 15 to 18 years and I'm still going to have to deal with it. And they're going to come back real angry. And there was also this view that anytime there was a mage kind of lost to the cycle of creation, you lost this stabilizing element of reality in the form of one of the avatars. And that was just kind of a setting contrivance I came up with. You could violate it in duress, but it kind of... Because one thing you can have is if there's a low mage count, they're always trying to kill each other. And I just didn't want to have that game, but that was me. But
so when you play a game like that where there's 100 mages, do you just say, okay, yeah, the Himalaya Wars, we didn't do that. That's not a thing that happened.
So in this case, there used to be more mages.
Okay.
But they either ascended or reality had tightened its grip or fewer people were awakening. I also kind of implied that after achieving mastery, mages start to feel a tug to go somewhere in the Umbra. So in the world, most people were adepts. There were maybe 10 true masters and 3 archmasters kind of kicking around out there. There was one character that was an oracle that just kind of showed up when you were experiencing a crisis. And did the Himalayan Wars happen? Possibly. It's one of those things where, like, maybe the Battle of Mistridge didn't occur, but the Himalayan Wars did. It was kind of based on what the characters were and how important it was. And it may be one of those things where the Himalayan Wars was 4 mages against 4 mages. It just you have a large Akashiana school, a large Euthanatoi Marabout that has this extended group of cities and custos that are behind it, maybe co-opting elements of local faith. The nature of that war certainly changes. But did every mage canon event happen? Like, for instance, did the March of the Nine happen? If the characters wanted it to, yes, but otherwise I wouldn't require it. Does the Order of Hermes have that same number of houses? No, it doesn't have 13 or whatever, probably. And you start getting creative. Like, one of the things I had was there was one Nefandus. It was the Nefandus. Maybe they represented the Devil Tarot card. It was a single soul that got pulled into the darkness in every lifetime. So they walked through the calls, they did their thing, and when they died, they came back with a little bit of taint. They weren't permanently inverted, but they came back, and kind of in each lifetime, they kind of fell to that dark tug and tried to take other people along with them and try and set it up so that the next time they came back, they would fall into darkness again. But at the same time, in every mage's journey, at some point this dark figure would approach and offer someone power and security in exchange for service. So it was almost like the way Wraith's harrowing was supposed to work. This like psychodrama to help you resolve something, that you would be approached. The technocracy was just the grand old men. I think I had 12 total technocrats in that setting, but they had a staff of thousands. They spent most of their time doing force multiplier projects. Like, every one of them had a dozen clones or a staff of 100 or a whole bunch of robots, or was using a hyper-intelligent AI to assist them, or was using digital co-location. And that was kind of how they maintained the edifice of the technocracy, even though the entire group could occupy like one reasonably large table at a Chuck E. Cheese.
So to go back one example to your one Nefandus, if they're the tempter and there's always one Nefandus in into every generation, a great evil must be born. Is their job to tempt the next Nefandus? And if so, do they like get a free ride the next turn? And if they fail to tempt anybody, is it them again? Is that how this works?
Yeah, they're always trying to expand their numbers. And possibly one of the reasons that the number of mages has dropped over time is that magus is successfully tempted and then consumed by the darkness. So maybe there's one recruiter and the rest of them are just like gone after that, which, if you lose 1% of the extant avatars, I think that personal journey of damnation becomes much more important to the group as a whole. Like, if the hope that carries your group winds up being the thing that falls, not only have you felt a personal loss in the form of that person, but your group may have lost its heir apparent. What does it mean if the only keeper of progenitor hypergenetics is the thing that winds up walking into the stars and being consumed? I think that to me is an interesting game.
Oh, I agree.
But you did wind up in weird places. Like, what do you do in a game when there's 3 hermetics and each one is more or less covering a house or two? And I think in mine I had them redone as chess pieces, and they were kind of the vanguard of Pymander or something like that. What is it like when there's a single dream speaker covering an entire continent or something like that? You really have to get on the high level real fast.
I mean, he's the only dream speaker in all of Australia.
In all of Antarctica. That's the one place.
That's an easier job.
Yeah,
that's an easier
all the
job.
mages just fighting each other down there.
When you have so few mages, do you supplement that with other denizens of the world of darkness? I mean, I understand that at your table, there's only the 5 to 8 players or however many you have in your weekly group. There's, like you said, there's only one dream speaker for all of Australia. Does he have a bunch of like werewolf friends that he sends out to do the cairn guarding and the spirit taming and all that? Or
generally, no. I do like to play a game where vampires are relatively ubiquitous and low power. It's not quite that a mage can mop the floor with it, but to me, that is an opportunity for a clever player to be like, look what I can do. Where, yes, in a white room, the vampire does rip out the mage's throat, but no mage is ever going to have that white room battle, and that is partially what makes mages fun. So to me, it was one of those things where vampires were always characters that the mage could mop up. They mostly spent time with their internal politics, but if they were wrong-footed, they were kind of boned. Their relationships in my game with werewolves, it just didn't really come up. I don't use werewolves a huge number of time. When I have werewolves in my games, it largely consists of only, if I had to reduce it, it would be like, there's a Theurge, and then there's an Arun, or something like that. You basically have spirit werewolf, and then you have fighty werewolf. And again, one can rip out your throat in one case, and the other one can rip out your throat, but more spiritually in the other one.
You can have a spirit of war rip your throat out.
Yes. But the thing that does come up is you can have exceedingly rare night folk just kind of be on equal turf, like mummies. I think those are always super fun. A few demons, creatures, or the other one would be the world had a few Jinn in it. The way I more or less had Jinn was I kind of gave them their own sorceress paths to represent it. They were basically immortal, and someone would be awoken to their Jinn nature as one of the options. So
their je ne sais quoi, as it were.
It was either you had a bad pun or I inadvertently had said something terribly racist, and I'm glad it was the bad pun.
No, it was a horrible pun.
I know.
Cut that.
Je ne sais quoi is now the name of the episode. Shit. I may be the host, but Terry still edits. But the other thing I would do is I would make the other ones equally rare. That, yeah, there might be a lot of generic Sabbat vampires, but there aren't a lot of vampires that kind of really know what's going on. Your equivalent of your 9th generation or lower or something like that, where they have similar binds. They're constantly dealing with their own politics. And at that point, you can use the other night folk to kind of reflect whatever you want. So for instance, you have the characters interact with vampires, and there's a lot more of them, and everything is more ritualized, everything is more formalized. You got the harpy, you got the sheriff, you've got the prince, you've got all the archons and so on, and you're like, oh wow, maybe is this what it would look like if there were 10,000 mages? I don't know. And then maybe on the other end, you have a character interact with a mummy who will never see another of their kind maybe at the same time throughout their mummy life, because there's both the implication that mummies live for an extremely long period of time before dying and an extremely brief period of time before re-dying. I can really see it going either way. But companions generally were weird things. So for instance, a sentient Volkswagen. Another one was the spirit of the Dipsy brand dumpster, like the original one that gave us the Dipsy dumpster. That was another one. A notable ghost sometime. But like with that small level, everything got to be unique. And that really takes away, when you're dealing with people who've done all the World of Darkness all the time, it really takes out some of that meta knowledge in terms of utility, which some players enjoyed, and others, it felt like they had lost a sense of smell or something. Like you kind of you kind of got used to just kind of getting how the world worked.
So in a world with just a few mages, would you just eliminate some groups or combine some groups?
Very much so. One of the things that's important to me is I generally don't have characters start with the traditions. I generally don't have players start with choosing a tradition unless they show some inclination towards the traditions. Usually it's come up with a wizard type where it's like, oh, I want to do mental illusions, or I want to control fire, or I want to be the technology guy. And we build the character, and then I kind of say at a critical point, do any of these groups, are they interesting to you? So one thing I did was collapse the traditions together. And this to me is a really fun mental exercise. So there's 9 traditions. There could have been any number. Like we could rerun it and Stuart Wick comes up with 7 spheres and the 7 traditions. Okay, which 2 do you get rid of? And to me, it's always fun to kind of see what the weird through line of them is. Like, I can very much see the Cultists of Ecstasy being split off into the Ascetics, which could join the Akashiana or something like that, and kind of the more Joy Seekers, which could be these Harbingers and could be these free love Celestial Choristers or Etherites or something like that. Like, there's almost always a weird way to jam it together because no group in Mage is like unitary, really. The closest we get is the Akashiana, where it's like Asia, and I'm like, really, guys, that's the best we could come up with.
To be fair, they added at least 3 other groups, and only I think one of them was like horrifyingly demonic possessed. So, you know, they branched out eventually.
There's also a lot of Asia. Yeah, I'm just Reverend Lovejoy, where he's like, whether you be Christian, Jewish, or miscellaneous, and Apu's like, there are 800 million of us. So, for instance, you could have the Earth's Blade, which is a blend of the Verbena, Dream Speakers, and Euthanatoi, the Mind's Eye Society, which is the Akashiana, plus like the Hermetics, focusing on will and self-perfection, the Extant Dreamers, which are just kind of big thinkers about humanity, about the Society of Ether, the Cult of Ecstasy, and the Celestial Chorus, and then the Virtual Adepts or something that represents like all technomancy or something like that. To me, it's a really fun exercise to say, what would happen if we jammed these 2 groups together? Or what would the world look like if these 2 groups redistributed all their little bits to other groups? One exercise I like doing is saying, like, what would it look like if every tradition had gotten a different seat on the council? Like, what does it look like if the Hermetics do get Spirit, which to me should have been their thing, but I get why the Dream Speakers got it.
It makes more sense, yeah.
Yeah, but
Dream Speakers obviously get mined because that's where dreams happen.
And how much more menacing, for instance, does the Celestial Chorus become if they get the Sphere of Mind? And you're like, oh, the religious people have the ability to control thought. This is a different commentary than maybe what we got with them controlling Prime. But I think that's a fun exercise. So in those settings, I either don't have the traditions, collapse them down, or you kind of break them down into the council being the group, and people having different manifestations of that. So in this very small mage world, maybe there's 20, 25 mages that represent the traditions. And as mages born or die and come from different magical backgrounds, those become the individual traditions, as we would call them. But again, at this point, if you only have 1 or 2 practitioners, why put a name on it? And I think we can get to... Yeah, we can get to much more interesting places. It does require a bit more worldcraft from you as a storyteller to come up with names. And sometimes you'll have a player that's like, that's stupid. This is just like the wish.com version of the virtual adepts. To which I say, come up with your own wish.com version of the virtual adepts then, if you don't
make your own name. There's 3 of you.
Yeah. So that's what those things kind of look like. Yes, it results in a lot of those things being eliminated. Also, as you mentioned, how did you get from there to here? Like, what if there was some cataclysmic mage event? What if World War II, the Nefandi do summon the Star Squid and almost all mages die? Like, I think these give some really interesting opportunities to really rethink what you want your setting to do.
Absolutely. So speaking of what you want your setting to do, what does one of your normal table games look like?
One of my normal table games, again, kind of goes from how many players do I have, how many agents do I kind of want in the setting, and how many mages does that get me to? So for me, I usually start out by saying, what are the factions that I want to use? So my most recent game set in Philadelphia, we had something like 30 mages on the Eastern Seaboard, and I'm like, I want there to be 2 technocratic factions. I want there to be this weird iterator plus void engineer thing, and I want this other thing to be this weird syndicate plus progenitor thing, and kind of have a blurry line, because like if the players aren't going to be interacting with the people directly, I never need to define these things too explicitly. Okay. I want 2 or 3 tradition groups, one that's high powered and traditional, one that's medium power and a bit of an upstart, and one that's mucking around with powers greater than I want. I want to be able to bop around to the cities on the East Coast. And based on that, and then I want to have 4 players plus someone who's able to make about every other session. So I got to about 30 mages covering something like 50 million people. And that's kind of how I came out to that number. Depending on how you define the Eastern Seaboard, I tended to look at an area from Boston and its metro area down to like Washington and its metro area. I didn't want the Nefandi to be a thing that was big in the area. I wanted 1 or 2 disparates, and I did want 1 or 2 marauders that could kind of be these weird little wild cards. So that's how I came up with that. Then the next thing to me is like, how do I want to distribute the power? I'm like, well, I want there to be a couple masters in the United States, and I want there to be maybe 5 in this region. So 1 out of 6 million is a master. Cities are kind of run by adepts or lower. Arete 2 through 5 is the most common. So I had, ultimately for my 30 mages, I came up with something like 2 at Arete 1, 5 at Arete 2, 8 at Arete 3, 7 at Arete 4, 5 at Arete 5, 2 at Arete 6, and 1, just a big number if I needed it to be. And that's kind of how I came up with that. The other question for me is the distribution of factions. And the other thing to me is kind of the distribution of the factions. So I had something like, in my head, I usually run with something like 5% Marauders, 10% Nefandi, 35% Traditions, 25% Technocracy, 10% Crafts, and 15% like other.
Random one-offs.
Yeah, I like having sui generis things. I do dislike the term orphan, or I like doing the thing where it's like, this is an Archmaster orphan. Like, he's an orphan because he killed his family, not because he's cold and alone. So like he's the one that survived from his brood. And for me, if you're playing 5,000 mages, that's still like 1,750 traditionalists and 1,200 technocrats. You can run a global conspiracy with that. I generally have about a quarter to a third off Earth or in quiet or otherwise like out of play. So one of the larger traditions like the Order of Hermes might have 200 people in it, and the Euthanatoi may have 100. group membership is going to be flexible. Like someone may grow into and out of a tradition. It's more like political alignment or a school you go to than something core to your identity that you play with. At that level, small regional factions also become interesting, which I wish is something Mage had. It kind of has that through the crafts, but it splits between these large global things and these weird local things where it's like, they protect the Holy Land, or they protect a different Holy Land. So, but if I want to have like the Children of Franklin or something like that, and that be like the powerhouse in the greater Philadelphia area, and they have this weird etherite, ecstatic, but diplomatic tint to them, I like having that as just a thing I can insert. This may all just be a reaction to me having run a lot of Mage and being like, screw it, I'll make my own with blackjack and hookers. And by that I mean Benjamin Franklin.
Obviously.
Yeah.
He covers both bases, yeah.
Yeah.
I think you may have just answered this question, but what do you see as the main appeal of limiting the setting to such a relative handful of mages?
One, mages get to be really real movers and shakers. It frequently makes the primary interaction mage on non-mage. And I think a lot of the weirdness of the setting comes from you're like, oh, I have the ability to see into the ultraviolet or infrared spectrum, and you don't. Or, so for instance, I will frequently have characters that do things that mixed the magical and the mundane. So for instance, a common one I have is a mage therapist who has both a vampire and maybe a sentient chimera, as well as mortal patients. And before each session, we do 3 minutes of them. And we talk about Mrs. Murphy feeling as if the passion is gone from her marriage. And then the next session, we talk about the feeling as if the Fomorians will rise and consume all humanity. And I think there is something powerful in kind of putting those two together. I like the sense of collegiality. I think really interesting questions arise from, I don't agree with you, but in some way you and I are alike. And I don't want that light to go out. Like we get the idea in Vampire that they are solitary hunters, but they crave the company of their own kind. Like, how far are we willing to go to deal with family to a certain extent, or to give someone the benefit of the doubt? Like, how much rope are you willing to give someone before you do decide to pull that trigger? Like, no, we've tried to convince you that there are other ways to walk the path of thorns, but it really looks like you're going to wander into the outer dark. And when you pull that trigger and their amygdala explodes, this is a person you've spent hours, days, years talking to, and I think that is a bit more impactful. The other thing is it gives space for really clever mortals. A mortal with wits 5 or intelligence 5 or perceptions 5 has figured out that there's something going on. And role-playing through that, I think, is interesting. One of the most powerful things a mage can do is kind of explain their paradigm to another character, or explain magic to a mortal, or something like that. Like, what is their version of the straight dope? Also, I just think it's easier to keep track of everything. The character maps get a little more easy. I don't have to worry about how powers interact quite so much. And it also prevents them from saying someone else needs to take care of this problem. There isn't anyone else. Like, there's a problem. Mulhectorus has risen in the underworld. You're the only person with spirit and entropy to enter the underworld. You got to do this, or something bad is going to happen.
Have fun.
Yeah. I try not to make it being like world destroying things, but if they fail, it is going to reshape the setting. So those tend to be my draws. But I think I just think there's something powerful to like, no, you know all the mages. Here are the 25. There's really only very rarely is there going to be a new piece on the board if someone wanders in or someone wanders off. And that is just kind of an intimacy. And I may be using that as a crutch. Like if I were a better storyteller, I could probably do that with an Enchantry. But I really hate Harry Potter games. Figure of speech I use where it's like magic people mostly doing magic with other magic people. And we're all in on the joke. Like what? I don't know. That great. Have your umbral game. It's just not something I find interesting. So like my version of street level is high power. Like, yes, you're on the street, but you're an adept. Like, I think it's perfectly easy to have those games be Earthside, but that's just me.
Given that the mages are divvied up among several competing factions, you got the traditions, the technocrats, the nefandists, the disparates, maybe an orphan here and there. How do you represent that kind of inherent conflict in the system when there's only 2 or 3 or fewer people on each side in an area? If you have 1 mage per million people, did the 2 mages in Houston call their buddy over in New Orleans when the 3 technocrats in all of the southwestern United States make a move on the Chantry? Or do they just Sorry, good luck. Try to hold on as long as you can.
It's going to be a mix. So with that few, it is much more interpersonally driven. So for instance, that Chantry raid, unless you had done something to really tick off the technocrats or decided to have it be a high power game, that would actually probably start with the power going out because your bill had been due for several months. And oh, by the way, this area is being rezoned. There's their highway coming through here. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about your node. So the means of action against other people tend to be more subtle and indirect, because that way the other actors have the ability to maintain plausible deniability. So one thing I almost always do in games is City Hall is controlled by the Nefandi. This is not my commentary on government, but this is me saying that a person who has control over zoning in a very real way has significant power in a city. And if there's only going to be 5 Nefandi in North America, they're going to go straight to the heart of power. Like, one of them is going to control zoning in a major city. One of them is going to try and control Wall Street. One of them is going to be active on Capitol Hill. And that is the way they kind of maximize their agenda. Do they call in? No, but one of the common things is I will have things like that. Mages are very slippery. It's very hard to trap them. So you may have wonders scattered across the region. You may have allies all over the place. You may have a whole bunch of custos that owe you favors, and those tend to be the networks that get activated first.
Gotcha.
Every once in a while, you could hear something like in that 100 Mage game, hey, the Nefandus, for the first time, we know the Nefandus is coming to try and tempt Timmy. We're going to try and make a move. And that's the rare case where you try and set that up, because if you fail and your bust doesn't work, a significant portion of the traditions could die at once. One poorly timed hand grenade or one very well timed hand grenade could see that. So actions tend to be pretty conservative. The other thing is, in a low mage count setting, people kind of know each other. So one of the things that you frequently do is you try and figure out what I can get away with. So like, for instance, you're dealing with your technocrats. Say you still have the precepts of Damien. Different technocrats believe in different parts to different degrees. Mm-hmm. Some say bring order to the masses is more important than defend them from creatures of the night. And by kind of feeling those things out, you can figure out where the cleavages are. A kind of another thing that gets reduced in a rare mage setting is, if you want to play the Grand Conspiracy, you can, but the ability to influence the masses is kind of limited. So you spend a lot of time dealing with weird threats, possibly, but kind of back to that key question. Occasionally you will be able to call in an ally. Correspondence 3 is great for that. But you generally have these defenses which are set up in layers to prevent something like that. You'll have an early warning system. You'll have scattered bases. You'll have mortals that alert you if something weird is happening. And only slowly do you kind of ascend that. So likewise on the technocrat side, it is hard for them to get 10 hit marks or whatever to kind of descend on you, because that would represent an extreme outlay of their abilities and power. So it's one of those things where like there's a little bit of a symmetry there. It also may mean that the closest mage to you is super weird in your opinion, being like, yeah, we can call on Jerry for help, but we're not sure if he's a marauder or not. And I just think that's kind of an interesting way to do things.
Yeah, I agree. That makes sense too, yeah. With a small head count, how do you handle like master and apprentice style dynamics? What do you do if more than one person at the table takes a background representing ties to different mages? You know, I don't know about your table, but we always have a social butterfly player at my table, and he knows everybody. You know?
Yeah.
He has all the contacts, he has all the allies, he has a master, he has an apprentice, he has everything. So how do you handle something like that?
So luckily with a table, if everyone at the table has 2 connections, that only brings us up to defining 15 mages. And even if I were playing, hey, there's only 30 on the Eastern Seaboard, I would probably say which one of these are near and which one of these are distant. You can either have someone who is close and weak, or distant and powerful, which is a kind of a differentiation that a lot of systems make, where they're like, hey, as this track increases in terms of allies, you get to choose one of these 2. They're either on call or more powerful. You don't get both unless you really dump a lot of points into it. Sometimes there's going to be overlap, and sometimes there's going to be question marks. So it's one of those things where they can choose to define it from the outset. But to kind of fit with the world, mages have their own stuff going on. So I've rarely run into players that start out with a 5-dot ally or a 6-dot ally. And if they did, I felt like the world was getting too known. You're generally a Star Wars fan?
Oh yeah.
Do you remember that period of time where there was like nothing new happening in the world? Like, oh, you're Admiral Akbar's brother, or like you're
Here's more tales from Mos Eisley Cantina.
yeah, and you're like, this universe is getting surprisingly small. Like, can we get a new character with a new plot line? And for me, one of the things I would do is I'd say something like, okay, what if instead of having a mentor, you actually have a 4-dot grimoire? Would that be okay? Or what if your 3 dots in contact aren't necessarily another mage, but is actually an avatar on the digital web that you're not really sure what it is? So I might try and make it a little bit weirder if I feel like we're filling in too much of the map. The other thing to do would be to figure out, okay, what makes this area a mage hotspot? If we want to preserve that. I don't know what I would do if a character had like 5 1-point contacts and was like, they're all mages. I would probably have to be like, no, they're not. They're not all mages.
They're all what you think of as mages.
Yeah.
But 3 of them are sorcerers. One of them's a vampire, maybe.
I had one of my favorite ones was, if you're very sparing with your descriptions, you can maintain ambiguity for a long period of time, to the point where I basically had this one weird vampire that was obsessed with electricity, was a huge fan of Nikola Tesla when he was immortal, and like the Westinghouse research and so on. So I had my players genuinely convinced that in this setting, vampires fed off of electricity, and all of them were like obsessive steampunk tinkerers, which, fine. But yeah, as you mentioned, this is what you think a vampire is, but in actuality, this is just this weird idiosyncratic one person that happens to have this lightning harpoon that scares the living shit out of you every time he pulls it out and goes, "Tonight we hunt," and just pulls out these giant spears and launches off on his gyrocopter or something. That to me is what the World of Darkness needs more of. Terror and horror are 2 different things, and it's important to have both in games.
Agreed. Mage has just a ton of groups. How do you support them?
I don't. That one, I do not have enough members to support every group at every time. But the big thing I do is there's a lot of tomes, primers, Principia, wonders, the cult background. There's ways to maintain that knowledge and understanding of a group between there being an awakened practitioner. So for instance, you may be the sole awakened member of the Aided, or one of the only members of the Hierarchanoi in North America. There was a time when there were 4, maybe 5, maybe 10 if you have a mage past where it collapsed. But that group had the foresight to say, hey, reality is working against us. We're going to write everything down in our grimoire. It's going to be this combination political manifesto, holy text, instruction manual that is also a portable node, or maybe a wonder. One of the things that I think is interesting is, okay, the grimoire is a 4-dot grimoire. It can get you up to a Rite 4. What about beyond that? And now you need to strike out on your own, and you need to find the one lost master that's in the deep umbra. Likewise, as you awaken, there may be a cache of sacred or secret artifacts that you kind of inherit that mortals give to you. Like, it could be one of those, your mother gave this to me. She said you know when you would need it, or something like that. Sometimes I'll have games where sorcerers kind of fill in the blanks, partially because I like the confusion. I understand when people say the difference between an awakened mage and a sorcerer is obvious, but the more I stare at it, the more I can come up with scenarios where it would be really hard to tell the 2 apart, unless you were able to like put them in a test tube and like shake them. So like, it's hard to tell the difference between someone who, for instance, just doesn't use forces to control the weather, and a mage that is a stormcaller, and somebody who has weather manipulation as a ritual path. Like, it can still be kind of hard to tell the difference between the 2, just because, like, is this something this person can't do because they don't have the appropriate dots? They don't have forces 2 or forces 3. Is it something that doesn't fit within their paradigm, where they're like, what are you talking about? Weather is the domain of chaos. It's the one thing humanity can't control. I don't know why you would. Or is it just the fact that the effect failed a bunch of times? So like, I think that wall can be a little bit fuzzier. But the big thing for me is I fill it in with backgrounds. And that also lets it be very much a personal thing. Your character becomes the next Hermetic, and then you have the Tome of Pymander, and it is your job to keep that grimoire safe add to it and document the goings on of the order and your personal journey of enlightenment and discovery. And I incorporate that into the game, where I say, hey, it's been a while since you've added a page to the Book of Ascendant Glory. You're one of 4 choristers out there or something. What new story do you write? What new song have you added to it? And now we have an opportunity for XP. And that's our chronicle book and guide. And I think that's kind of a fun thing. An important one to me is everyone gets the requisition background. It's kind of janky, but that is where that weird social pull comes in, where you have the ability to go like, I need a wonder for this, or like, I need to deal with this particular thing. Eventually you can get what you need. It might be a little bit slow, and it's not quite as efficient as it would be in a full technocracy game, but it tends to be there. One thing that came up that is suggested and revised and never followed up on is the idea that wonders manifest. So one of the things I do is characters can create wonders, but I also allow them to spend XP, and a wonder kind of appears.
Okay.
Suddenly they discover that one of their mortal and pestles has this enchantment on it. And we've agreed to it ahead of time. We've kind of worked out the details. But within the game, the character's magic has so infused their tools that it's become something else. Something in the spirit of that item has awakened. Or a bit of the dreaming has connected to. Or a bit of the high umbra has come through. Or it's actually a fetish and that there's a spirit inhabiting it. And that way I don't need someone to have Prime 4, go on a quest of purification, get 30 successes, come up with 200 pawns of TAS or something like that. And I just think that's kind of fun. And when, again, there's so few mages, questions of balance become a lot easier because you never have to run these like mass battle system board game scenarios. So everyone can
say, well, if I have this, why doesn't the opposing faction have 30 of this?
Yes.
Because that
very
makes
much
sense.
so. And I guess the last thing is training becomes kind of messy. And one of the things that I have running around in the back of my head is sometimes your mentor needs to be better at it than you are. For instance, I think it would be hard to learn French from someone who didn't know French better than you. But at the same time, I can learn a physical skill, a talent, an ability from someone who can't necessarily do it better than me. So for instance, I took sporting instruction on how to do pistol shooting. The person who shot had an injury. They could not shoot better than me, but they were a skilled mentor and they were skilled at pedagogy and they were able to tell me what I was doing wrong. Oh, it's obvious that you're doing this. You're jerking off to the side whenever you do this particular thing. You're flinching in this way. They couldn't shoot better than me, but they knew how to instruct well and provide feedback. So there's this world where someone could be as skilled in terms of pedagogy, even if they don't have spheres that you have, they can still kind of direct you. And if you view magic as being this kind of embodied thing, as opposed to this more academic form of knowledge, you now get this type of instruction and feedback that becomes a little bit different and kind of takes the edge off the fact that, I don't have the right instructional material, or, I don't have the appropriate mentor. Now mentor ability is different than magical ability, and I kind of like that.
I like that as well. So what kind of threats do you introduce in a world with just a few mages?
In a world with just a few mages, it's pretty common to deal with weird spirits. I'm a big fan of mortals doing stupid stuff. I like the idea of there being weird supernatural outbreaks of things. So an area could literally be infested by spirits of rage or love, and that's causing all sorts of problem. I frequently will steal things from Exalted at the lower level. There's the Candle of Love spirit that basically you fill up so much with love that your heart eventually bursts into actual flame. And I think that's a fun antagonist to have, especially if magic kind of cleans up over that. I will frequently have city spirits that need to be appeased and interacted with. There may be a mage that does need your help going to an umbral realm to retrieve things. So when you have so few mages, favor trading kind of becomes an important thing. And then there's always mortals. I like having characters deal with gang violence. I like characters dealing with shady contractors who are trying to get a homeless encampment removed so they can build crappy McMansions or something like that. It really lets me kind of focus on that mortal side. But the big thing to me is kind of the interface with the mortal and the supernatural, to be like, oh, there is this homeless encampment, but also the fear around the homeless encampment is feeling this paranoia spirit, which is creating these weird hobgoblins, which are breaking into people's houses. So you kind of have a mundane and a magical problem that are tied together in this neat little metaphor bow.
I do like that.
Thank you.
Also, excellent use of city spirits. I love city spirits.
Uh-huh.
Final question from me. Then we'll get to some listener questions and comments. What do you feel that low mage count games lack?
Oh, the glorious breadth. There is no Doizatep. There is no horizon. They're never going to step into the Grand Hall and see 100 Aetherites working on 100 projects. There's never going to be that grand sweep. There's never going to be that moment of magical revelation. The closest you would get would be something like 3 Aetherites are in the Inventium, and they've kind of claimed a corner of it. Or something like the Verbena Seasonal Realms, which were found but not created. I fully recognize that's a bad example because it depends on your edition. But and the closest I will have to Doizatep is kind of the abandoned fortress of an Archmaster. Like, Porthos was one of those mages, and he blew up during the conflagration. And now there is this mansion floating across the surface of Mars, half suspended in a shade realm, half suspended in the penumbra, teeming with traps and objects, possibly with this weird force ghost emanation thing wandering around it. That's kind of the closest I'll get. You'll never get that real sense of camaraderie that I am part of this giant ancient tradition. It is, at best, I am the heir to this family legacy or tradition. There are no college chantries or something like that. The idea of Curtamane, for instance, is almost ridiculous. You're like, there's 9 mages. They're going to settle it like adults with guns.
Rochambeau.
Yeah, yeah, rock, paper, scissors, shoot. Hey, if you can't use lifetime or mind to get the result that you want from that, that's on you.
If I learned anything from Mind's Eye Theater, rock, paper, scissors is the way to resolve conflicts.
Mm-hmm. So you miss a lot of that. The world-shaking stuff becomes kind of hard to deal with. Like the idea of a void ship or something where a lot of mages would have to work for a long period of time is kind of rough. The other thing is it's hard to make it so that there's a big threat, but you can still fail. You kind of... The Week of Nightmares, the Ravnos Antediluvian, so Zapathasora takes it in the face. Either the technocracy didn't get to do that, and the world of Mage just kind of stood by and saw it happen, or the technocracy did, and the fact that there's only 10 of them, they were still able to drop a neutron bomb. Like, I don't like either of those. Really. Yeah. They have a real weird mouthfeel to them. So that's what you lose. You also lose, as you mentioned, you lose a lot of the little groups. You lose a lot of the meta plot that depends on it. You can pick a few, but you really have to reinterpret what it means. And it makes it hard for mages to be heirs to a particular culture, just because as the numbers drop, it's just going to become more idiosyncratic. So frequently you'll get something like noted architect at Falling Water.
Frank Lloyd Wright.
Thank you. Like, Frank Lloyd Wright was notionally the head of the Prairie School, but Frank Lloyd Wright was Frank Lloyd Wright. Like, I could argue that Alphonse Mucha was Art Nouveau, but his style was so distinctive it was him. Right. You don't get a lot by comparing it to Toulouse-Lautrec or something like that. They were just titans, each in their own way. And mages become the same way. You never get to talk about a tradition or a paradigm in a generic sense because it's going to be so heavily inflected. And if you really want to use Mage as a jumping off point to show how much you know about real-world herbalism or real-world stone lore or something like that, you kind of lose that. So those are the big things that I feel that you lose in that very small mage count setting.
That was all of my questions, but we do, like I said, have some listener comments and a few questions as well. Bertica Moose comments that this environment would seem to me to swing toward 2 poles, 1 or 2 major traditions, or a boatload of orphans, or just 1 tradition and a lot of orphans.
One of the things that depends is you have to have some sort of degree to which you say that traditions can find their own. In 1E, it was kind of suggested that when a mage awakens, they're able to figure out that another mage has awakened nearby. Revised, of course, gives us a system like on the number of miles versus their initial arete versus your perception in terms of your ability to catch it.
Perception plus awareness. If you get 2 successes, you'll know the direction of the mage that just awakened.
But not the distance.
3 successes.
Yeah. So one of the things I do to prevent it from collapsing is there is this multipolarity to it. So kind of like Europe before World War I, you kind of have this idea of the concert of Europe, that if anyone is getting too powerful, there tends to be a movement against them. So if a group is getting too powerful, generally I have them become more doctrinaire, which discourages additional people from joining. Or if a group is seemingly too weak in the setting and I don't want to play that up, well, they actually have access to these considerable resources. They have this Chantry realm, they have this node, they have this hereditary familiar, they have this wonder, whatever. And that kind of keeps a bunch of balanced things. The other thing is you kind of make it geographic. Like, what does it look like when most of Europe is hermetic, but most of the United States is virtual adepts? And then that becomes a bit more of a cultural thing. So yes, in any given area, there's a dominant tradition with a little one. Part of the fun you then get to do in that orphan game is, hey, I heard rumors that there are these people like me over here. Let's go find them. And then it's like, okay, how do I find a hermetic in France? Like, that becomes a game unto itself. And then the tricky part there then becomes like balancing that with a group. So either everyone has gone through it, you have to explain why your little group is special, or have some nod or contrivance to it. But yeah, that can happen, but there are mechanisms to prevent it from collapsing into the one tradition, a whole bunch of orphans playstyle.
Lucid asks, with the large amount of official mage factions, how do you have them present and make sense without house ruling most of them out? And I think you already answered this during your earlier questions.
Yeah. So I have them so that they all existed at some point, but they may not all exist at once. Again, tomes, primers, wonders, cult background, mortals that maintain the tradition, sorcerers, and so on, that maintain it through. Another one that's useful are spirits. Spirits remember the kind of the ways of magic, even if they themselves can't do it. But yeah, I feel perfectly comfortable ruling a bunch of them out. The hardest part is figuring out what portions of the mage canon are still there and which aren't. And at least in my experience, I haven't dealt with a terrible number of players where it's like, no, it's vital that we've already talked about the Himalayan wars happened. It's like, no, the burning times had to have happened, or something like that.
Okay. Patrick J has a comment. Remember that mages are tied to geography even less than most sleepers are, and their home influences are likely broader than a city. And other mages can visit or commute pretty easily. Also, in a small-scale setting, even if you have not met another local mage on your side of the Ascension War, you probably know of them. And you will likely also know all of your tradition or crafts, chantries, and most of their members, if only in passing. Also, because mages are such a rare resource, killing or risking death is very rare, and opposing mages would rather thwart the other's plans or attempt recruitment, which sounds like Patrick J and you have played at the same table.
This does bring up one fun game option that I do like. Since there are so few mages, favors can often put you in a weird place very quickly, where it's like, hey, I helped you, all 3 technomancers of the Southwest ganged up against you. I need you to help me with this Umbrood. And suddenly you're like, well, I don't have a background in spirit, and we need to figure this out real fast. And the other one that you get to do is kind of the comedy of manners game, when it's like, oh, I've never dealt with a chorister before, or I've never dealt with someone from the Mad Zimbabwe before, or I've never met with a mage that spends so much time in the Shadowlands. And now that gets to be a really big set piece, like that conversation, that navigation. Is there an effect that they get to do together? Do they get along initially? And if mages are rare and you probably haven't run into it, it's kind of like if you're in an area that doesn't really have a lot of ethnic diversity to it. When mages are rare, you get to have that cultural collision is something that you can really focus on without it just being an everyday occurrence because you're always bumping into a mage that's different than you. Or you do the thing where you're like, we're all cosmopolitan geniuses or something like that.
All right. We're going to end with 3 user questions. The first comes from Taifu499. Considering that most major cities have a large vampire presence, how would your mages interact with the kindred who live there? I can see a player or NPC being a court vizier to the prince.
Generally, I don't do court wizards. I try and have mages be forces of nature if they're being outnumbered by something. I generally play up how weird and alien both vampires would be to mages and how mages would be to vampires. Mages don't know the traditions off the top of their head. They don't know the myth of the antediluvians or anything like that, and vampires are very jealously going to guard that. But generally in those encounters, I make it a meeting of savage grace, where it is very evident that the beast is there, but someone is very good at controlling it. Most of my games, when vampires show up and involve mages, it is to try and use them as a chip against another faction. The Giovanni tend to be my favorite one to go to just because I kind of like ghosts as a theme, but I try and make it a very heavy emphasis on, do you really want to get involved in their stuff? And if you don't want to get involved, do you want to have someone in your own backyard who considers you to have wronged them? And that tends to be the focus I bring up. The other end, as I mentioned, vampires are just the equivalent of mooks, where you get to kill 20 shovel heads at once because you have this spectacularly prepared effect, but then you really need to book and hide until daylight. So again, my characters tend to have multiple locations within the city that they can hide to across a bunch of different neighborhoods. And if things go particularly wrong with the kindred, that's the direction I go with.
And the kindred will just be waiting for you tomorrow night. So yeah. Josh Hillerup asks, do the games all end up feeling like a weird family when it comes to the other mages the PCs interact with?
I have had games where it's felt like a weird family because it was players who had played Mage before talking about mages in the Mage setting, like they all realized that they were manipulating the consensus at the same time. Where I've had other games where it did not feel like a weird family, where everyone was kind of strange and different. So humans and a silverback gorilla are both kind of in the same family, but there's a clear difference between the two. There might be a glimmer of recognition that we two are like each other, but the abilities and nature of each force are kind of so different that rules out anything. And if someone were to be like, humans, gorillas, there should be peace between the two, like, I can't hear you over the sound of your arm being ripped off. But yeah, I have had it go in both directions. And sometimes I want to play up that weird family angle, and sometimes I don't. The most common one is what I'll call the weird family reunion dynamic, where there is one other person that practices your paradigm, and you just don't really get along with them, but you don't want to make it a thing. And that tends to be the most common.
Into anime, and you're just not.
Yeah. Like when at work, when people are like, Terry, you love games. Blah, blah, really likes Carcassonne or Settlers of Catan. I'm like, I would rather die. You and I are different kinds of nerds. So, yeah.
Final question from listener Puka G. How do you prefer to distribute arete levels among the small number of storyteller characters? How does that impact the feel of the chosen setting? And I think you already answered this earlier.
I kind of have a distribution where I want most of them to be medium power and a few to be at either end. And I'll keep that last thing as kind of a question mark if I want to. I have also run games which were very leadership focused, and the characters, especially as their arete increased, the first time a character gets to arete 5, the number of arete 2 and 3 characters in the world kind of ramps up. So like now they're the powerful mage. Now they're the real mover and shaker. Where do they want to put their attention? What are the important things to them? But in general, I generally have a somewhat smooth distribution between 3 and about 5, with a little bit more at the top or a little bit more at the bottom, really depending on what I need. If people want access to a master or an archmaster or someone particularly potent, I want it to be a little story unto themselves. And if I'm going to have someone that powerful picking on them, it was baked into the setting at the beginning, or they've really mess with the wrong person.
That makes sense to me. And that ends our listener comments and questions. Terry, thank you for joining me this evening for Mage the Podcast. Where can listeners find you?
Mage the Podcast, wherever you should be, bitch. For me in particular, I'm Terry Robinson on Twitter. I'm Terry Robinson in the Discord. Bryce, anything fun from, as our chief Darker Days radio correspondent, anything fun happening over there?
Actually, as we record this, just today, we released one of our episodes on the Realm of Fire. It's Chris and mostly Chris and Sean's little subset of Darker Days, where they talk about Necromunda, Ages of Sigmar, all that fun Warhammer 40k stuff that isn't my cup of tea. But we will have a Darker Days contingent at Gen Con. So if you listeners are going to be at Gen Con and you see one of us walking around, say hi. We're
Come
friendly.
for the darker, stay for the days.
Exactly.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where at our table there's always room for one more mage, unless we already have 5 players, in which case we're full. The show has been brought to you by its executive producers, who you can join at patreon.com/magethepodcast. First, we have the oracles of the following errors I made during this show. Ben Bendelow, oracle of me saying I was done with EP shoutouts when I hadn't done one for Ben Bendelow. Buck Gregory, oracle of me swapping out the Bosnawash region with 50 million people with the eastern seaboard with like 120 million people. Christopher Phillips, oracle of me dividing 50 by 10 and getting 6. Guy Stewart, oracle of me mixing the metaphor of giving someone rope and pulling the trigger. Jay Widener, of me wanting to say thalamus instead of amygdala. Josh Hillerup, oracle of me using an Italian accent when talking about a Spanish person. Mikhail, oracle of me calling Alphonse Mucha entirely unique when a great example of Art Nouveau, but probably not his own school. Pukaji, oracle of me saying Frank Lloyd Wright was the only known prairie school architect when Louis Sullivan did a number of celebrated buildings. Sean Gallagher, oracle of me not dividing 25 into 30 million properly. The crew of Erebus, oracle of me not removing listener questions I had already answered from the outline. Saint UX Player, oracle of me not knowing how many unique chess pieces there are. Jason Vines, oracle of some error I forgot that I made and didn't write down. And Derek Semsek, oracle of the opposite where I said something was an error, but in actuality I was correct. Along with Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Brad the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aran, Archmaster Nathan Weaver, as well as Alex, Alexia, Ambiversion, Andrews S, Anon, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Bob the Pale One, Chris Blake, Sinchodis, Connor Glosson, Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Eli Levenger, Eric Schwenk, Fragger Rock, George Lara, Gray Trillig H, Henry Kraft, Ia Bold, Jason Duncan, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jake Gatsby, Jeff Brin, Jenna F., Jervis Johnson, John Magnuson, Joel Andes, Lols and Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Minel Canoas, Matthew Prohl, Maurice Hopkins, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klamenov, Pax Cal, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Rachel Grace, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Seven Nessus, Starfish, Stephen Carton, Steve Wynyard, Thrice Great, Tyler Bryan, Vincent Hamilton, Walter, William Conley, William Martin, and Wolf Lyreson. Our EP shoutout this episode is to Ben Bendelow, who I'm hoping is the secret scion of Tom Bendelow, the Johnny Appleseed of American golf, or the Dean of American golf, depending on who you listen to, who was a Scottish-American golf course architect during the first half of the 20th century. He is credited with having designed over 600 courses in a 35-year span of work, and 6 of his designs have received designation by the National Park Service for their significance. His courses have often been called Olmstedian, in that his method of naturalistic design was greatly influenced by the work of prominent landscape architects Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. and Jr., that if a site had an especially unique feature, a rock outcropping, a stream, grove of trees, a scenic view, he would work his whole placements in such a way as to take full advantage of the features, even if that meant working his layout from the middle out. When I think of naturalistic golf course design and promotion, I'll think of you, Ben. If you'd rather listen on YouTube, search Mage the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at Mage the Podcast on Twitter. We have a Hub and Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye. How do we do it? We do need all 11 pages. This is stupid.
It's either 10 minutes or an hour and a half. There's no in between.
There's nothing in between. How do we want to roll into this one? Do you want to do the High Mage fans or?
Absolutely.
Fucking hey, that's the only reason I do this bullshit.
I've been on this podcast like 7 times. It's my time.
Now it's the Bryce show. Oh, thank God. A thing I didn't want to go to Friday got canceled.
Oh, that's the worst thing. I'm sorry.
You should move to Philly. That way, when it is in the triple digits, it's also 175% relative humidity.
We have ridiculously high humidity too. So,
oh, okay. It's not a dry heat?
No, that's like Arizona and New Mexico. It's a very moist heat.
Did I ever tell you about it's a dry cold?
No, I don't.
I was at Arches National Park one day and it was 112 degrees, but it was 4% relative humidity. It's the hottest I've ever experienced. To the point where when I opened my mouth, I could feel my saliva evaporating when I exhaled. It was ridiculous. Like it felt like there was a fine layer of pop rocks on my mouth.
That's kind of cool to be honest.
Yeah. And we did this short little hike where it's like, well, we're going 2.5 miles. What's the rule of thumb? Gallon per mile. Okay, let's go. So we were just chock full of fluids and we got done and we're like, well, that was, so the one part of it was Chris is like, hey, I think I'm done. I need to turn back. And I'm like, okay. He's like, well, I think you should finish the hike. I'm like, no, I'm not going to abandon you to heat stroke. Turns out we were like 100 feet from like the money shot view of Arches where you see like the arch in the distance and invariably there's like a pronghorn or something there or a German or something. I don't know.
There's an eagle flying by overhead.
Through it, yes. Our next stop for the day was the northern rim of the Grand Canyon. So it went from like 112 degrees to 38 degrees and raining.
Jeez,
and we get out there and just the first noise I make is my testes being pulled into my thoracic cavity from the 70 degree temperature drop from last time I was outside. It's just like, ha! I think was the precise noise I made. So we put on literally every article of warm clothing that we have to deal with the rain. And Chris just looks at me in his thick Oklahoma accent and goes, at least it's a dry cold. It was not, in fact, a dry cold.
No,
But
no, it wouldn't be.